General to investigate Biden for those preemptive pardons. Trump said that he went through 4 years of hell with his legal prosecution and added,
"It's really hard to say that they shouldn't have to go through it also. It is very hard to say that."
I'm keeping this very trim and tight, but Trump just continued on and on for a while about the pardons and Biden, and so much so that when Hannity tried to change the topic, we saw this.
They wanted to take care of, yeah, but Sean, they wanted to, I don't care.
They're yelling at me.
This is more important because right now the economy is going to do great.
I want to know about
I'm here, so the economy. But you have to understand, he had bad advisors on almost everything.
Additionally, here on the topic of pardons, we saw Hannity also questioning Trump about his decision to pardon almost all the people that were convicted in connection to January 6th, including those who were charged with violent offenses against police, with Trump responding,
Number one, they were in there for 3.5 years, a long time.
Right.
And in many solitary confinement, treated like nobody's ever been treated so badly. They were treated like the worst criminals in history. And you know what they were there for? They were protesting the vote because they knew the election was rigged and they were protesting the vote. And that you should be allowed to protest the vote. You should be allowed to. When the day comes.
But you shouldn't be able to invade the Capitol.
No, ready? Most of the people were absolutely innocent. Some of those people with the police, true, but they were very minor incidents, okay? They get built up by a couple of fake guys that are on CNN all the time.
Nobody watches.
They were very minor incidents.
There's a few things to note about that clip. First of all, while Trump has blanket defended the people charged in connection to the insurrection countless times before, this really does go beyond what we've seen. You've got people saying, to be clear, this is the President of the United States explicitly saying that the insurrection is a form of protest that should be allowed and that the acts of violence against police taken that day were not serious offenses. You even had Hannity pushing back at the claim that invading the Capitol is a form of protest in that clip. But also, another thing that's really notable about this clip is that it's been widely omitted from the coverage of the interview that we've seen from a number of right-leaning outlets, where we've seen numerous major papers neglecting to mention those remarks in their coverage, including the articles Fox News published on their digital site. And more interestingly with Fox is while they did upload the clip on their website, they didn't include it on any of the 4 videos spanning nearly 40 minutes of content that they posted to YouTube. But then, going back to the interview, there were some other key moments that came, like when Trump was discussing federal aid for recent natural disasters, and specifically the fires in California and the hurricane that devastated North Carolina and other parts of the South. And there we saw Hannity asking this question about federal aid to California.
Should the money be contingent on them practicing the science of forestry?
Well, I think this. I'm going to put a statement out today, I think, and maybe it's already written. I said, I don't think we should give California anything until they let water flow down into their state.
From the north to the south.
This is a political thing. I don't know what it is. They talk about the Delta smelt. It's a little tiny fish like this.
I went out.
They say it's an endangered species. Well, how is it endangered? No wonder it's endangered. It's not getting any water.
Now with that, what I do have to note here is that those claims that Donald Trump is making, they're completely false, but he just keeps repeating them even after they've been widely debunked. But as we've talked about on the show, while the Delta smelt has become a conservative talking point, local officials have repeatedly said that conservation efforts for the fish had nothing to do with the hydrants running out of water. Right? They have made clear that there were so many fires that the municipal water system, which wasn't designed to fight fires, simply couldn't meet the demand needed. Which, a big key thing is that many experts have also said that would be true of any municipal water system in the United States trying to combat a blaze at that scale. And then, as far as his claims about California officials blocking water from the north from going to the south, that's just not how the system reportedly works, with the Washington Post, for example, explaining Los Angeles does not get its water from the northern California systems Trump described, and water experts have repeatedly explained that the scale and severity of the South California fires was not caused by empty reservoirs or a lack of water flowing from Northern California. And again, with all this, I will stress this. That is not to say that there were not major leadership issues during those fires. And in fact, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But still, I have to stress here, do not let all these falsehoods distract you from the substance here, which is that Donald Trump is threatening to withhold federal aid to California or make a condition. That is a move that would be a massive change from how the federal government normally responds to natural disasters, with many also noting here that recent hurricane aid that went to mostly GOP-led states was passed by Congress without conditions. Also, while we're here on the topic of federal disaster relief, another part of this whole interview that's been widely talked about were Trump's comments bashing FEMA.
FEMA is a whole nother discussion because all it does is complicate everything. FEMA has not done their job for the last 4 years. I had FEMA working really well. We had hurricanes in Florida. We had Alabama, tornadoes. But unless you have certain types of leadership, it gets in the way. And FEMA is going to be a whole big discussion very shortly because I'd rather see the states take care of their own problems. If they have a tornado someplace and if they let that state Oklahoma is very competent. I love Oklahoma. But you know what? If they get hit with a tornado or something, let Oklahoma fix it. You don't need. And then the federal government can help them out with the money.
Though also with that, Trump didn't elaborate on his plans to reform or abolish FEMA yet. But then the final moment that we're gonna hit on from this interview are Donald Trump making comments about TikTok when Hannity asked him about China and privacy concerns. Because there we saw Trump making, we'll call it an interesting new argument.
Those that say they know say it's a spying app for the communist Chinese.
But but you can say that about everything made in China. Look, we have our telephones made in China for the most part. We have so many things made in China, so why don't they mention that? You know,
Let me get to
the
some
interesting
issues.
thing with TikTok, though, is you're dealing with a lot of young people. So
They love it.
Is it that important for China to be spying on young people, on young kids watching crazy videos and things?
I don't want China spying on anybody.
No, but they make your telephones and they make your computers and they make a lot of other things. Isn't that a bigger threat?
Right, and so with that, you had a number of people arguing that this is a weird pivot for Trump, saying, you know, he's going from everything China does is evil, I will stop them at all costs, to, well, they're already spying on us through our computers and other stuff, so, you know, why start with TikTok? And so, yeah, understandably, there are a lot of people talking about numerous aspects here. Of course, I'd love to know any and all thoughts you have on the highlights here. And also, if you want to watch more of the interview, I'll link you in the description. But then, to shift to different news, we should talk about Donald Trump's newest pardons getting a lot of attention because he just issued full and unconditional pardons to 2 DC police officers convicted in connection to the cover-up of a young black man's death in 2020. Right, so all of this, it goes back to October 23rd, 2020, which notably was 5 months after the killing of George Floyd, which kind of sets the scene for you, and that's when Officer Terrence Sutton and Lieutenant Andrew Zabowski conducted what federal prosecutors described as an unjustified, illegal, and reckless vehicular pursuit. A pursuit where they were chasing 20-year-old Karan Hilton Brown. And according to the prosecution, Sutton and Zabowski, who were driving separate vehicles, saw Hilton Brown riding a moped on a sidewalk without a helmet, with him then reportedly ignoring the officer's attempts to stop him and drove off. And so Sutton chased him from behind while Zabowski drove on parallel streets to try and get ahead of him to cut him off. And so you had Sutton reportedly chasing Hilton Brown for 10 blocks, including at one point by driving the wrong way on a one-way street. He then reportedly pursued Hilton Brown into a narrow alley, turning off his vehicle's emergency lights and sirens and accelerating. What ended up happening is that when Hilton Brown exited the valley, he was hit by an SUV. And with all that, the video evidence reportedly showed Hilton Brown riding erratically on sidewalks and cutting in front of oncoming traffic. But also, a key thing in this case is that police department policy prohibited officers from chasing a motorist merely because of a traffic violation, right? Including, for example, operating a moped unsafely. But with that, we saw Sutton's attorney claiming they were pursuing Hilton Brown because he had actually been involved in a dispute earlier and they believed that he might have been going to retaliate against someone. But still for many, that didn't explain what reportedly happened next, which, according to the prosecution, was to, quote, bury all this under a rock, with a statement from the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia saying, as Mr. Hilton Brown lay unconscious in the street in a pool of his own blood, Sutton and Zabowski agreed to cover up what Sutton had done to prevent any further investigation of the incident. And specifically, the prosecution says that the officers turned off their body cameras and conferred with each other, with Sutton giving the driver of the SUV permission to leave. With then, the officers reportedly failing to notify the department's major crash unit as was required or secure the crash site for evidence collection. And then finally, here, according to the prosecutors, the officers misled their shift commander by describing the crash as relatively minor, downplaying Hilton Brown's injuries and leaving out any mention of a chase. And so what we ended up seeing is Sutton and Zabowski both being convicted on charges of conspiracy and obstructing justice in 2022, and Sutton also being found guilty on second-degree murder. And for all that, they were sentenced to 66 and 48 months in prison. Though, notably, the officers had remained free pending the outcomes of their appeals. And so now, thanks to Donald Trump's pardons, they're not going to be going to jail. And with that, you have the DC Police Department thanking Donald Trump, saying in a statement, the prosecutions were literally unprecedented. Never before in any other jurisdiction in the country has a police officer been charged with second-degree murder for pursuing a suspect. And then adding, the department recognizes the risks involved in vehicle pursuits, which are reflected in our pursuit policy, but violations of that policy should be addressed through training and discipline, not through criminal prosecution. So with all this, you have a number of people questioning if Donald Trump actually had a firm grasp on the details of this case. And that because he's actually been talking about it for a few days, saying things like, they were arrested, put in jail for 5 years because they went after an illegal. They arrested the 2 officers and put them in jail for going after a criminal, a rough criminal, by the way. And finally, I am the friend of police more than any president who's ever been in this office. Which I will say, there's just like 2 or maybe 3 or actually 4 things we need to talk about. Right? 1, as mentioned, those officers, they were not put in jail for 5 years. They were out on bail pending appeal. 2, Hilton Brown was reportedly just an African-American citizen, not an undocumented immigrant. 3, people have pushed back saying while Hilton Brown may have been breaking the law, according to court records, he didn't have any adult felony cases. Or with a number of people saying the only people actually convicted of crimes here were the police officers being pardoned. And then 4, I mean, as far as Donald Trump being a friend of the police, I feel like that is very complicated. But on one hand, a lot of police officers are actually reportedly outraged about Trump's pardoning of January 6th rioters, with even the Fraternal Order of Police, the largest police union in the United States, which actually endorsed Trump in the election, saying in a statement, allowing those convicted of these crimes to be released early diminishes accountability and devalues the sacrifices made by courageous law enforcement officers and their families. But then, on the other hand, along with pardoning police officers convicted of crimes, it appears